The blizzard hit on February 9th, 1884, at precisely 3:17 p.m. It did not arrive with warning, it simply materialized. One moment, the Dakota sky was a sheet of flat gray metal. The next, the world was a screaming vortex of white. The temperature, which had been a brisk 5 degrees, plummeted 40 degrees in 20 minutes. For James Thornton, this was the moment he had spent the last 7 months preparing for. He was mending a harness in the sheltered space between his cabin door and the mouth of the cave, when the wind's tone shifted from a moan to a shriek. He dropped the leather and awl, grabbed his chestnut horse, Copper, by the bridle, and led him deeper into the stable he'd carved from the side of the rock. Inside the small but sturdy cabin, built 20 feet back from the cave's entrance, his wife Ada was already barring the heavy oak door. The wind howled outside the rock, a furious, impotent beast. But inside the limestone walls of the mountain itself, there was only a profound and steady silence. The air was cool, not cold, holding at a constant 55 degrees, the natural temperature of the earth. 7 months earlier, in July of 1883, James Thornton had stood before Mayor Hutchkins in the dusty land office of Endurance, a town of 400 souls clinging to the vast Dakota prairie. The map was spread between them, showing the parcels available under the Homestead Act. Thornton's finger, stained with the grit of 8 years surveying for the railroad, rested not on the fertile flatlands, but on a rocky, scrub-covered bluff 2 miles north of town. "It's worthless land," Hutchkins had said, peering over his spectacles. "Can't plow it, barely graze it, got a big hole in the side of it." "That hole is why I want it," James replied, his voice calm and measured. The mayor leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "You aim to live in a cave, Thornton? This is 1883. We're building a civilized town here, with timber houses and glass windows. We're not savages. I aim to build a timber house, Mayor, with glass windows, inside the cave." Hutchkins stared, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at Ada, who stood beside her husband, her expression serene. She offered a simple nod of confirmation. The mayor shook his head, a slow, disbelieving motion. "That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard. But it's your 160 acres to ruin." He stamped the papers with a thud that seemed to signal the end of Thornton's sanity. The plan, to anyone but James, seemed like madness. But to him, it was pure logic, a conclusion drawn from years of observation. While blasting tunnels for the Northern Pacific, he had felt the unyielding coolness of the rock in summer and its relative warmth in winter. He'd spent a winter with a Pawnee scout who taught him how to read the land, how wind scoured the flat plains but flowed over and around hills like water. He learned the principle of thermal mass. The earth itself was a massive natural battery, storing and releasing heat with an efficiency no man-made structure could match. He explained it to Ada on their first night camping at the site. "The cave faces south," he said, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. "That means it gets the low winter sun, but the high summer sun will pass right over the top. The entrance is 40 feet wide and 25 feet high, but the cave narrows to about 30 feet wide, 60 feet back. We'll build the cabin 20 feet in from the mouth. That gives us a 20-foot deep, 40-foot wide natural porch, a buffer zone. The wind will never touch our walls." Ada, whose father had been a master carpenter, added her own knowledge. "The limestone is dry. We'll raise the cabin floor 2 feet off the cave floor on stone piers, so no moisture can ever wick up. the timbers will stay preserved for 100 years. The rock itself will be our insulation, James continued. In summer, when it's 95 degrees out there, the cave will stay at 55. In winter, when it's 40 below, the cave will still be 55, Ada finished for him. We'll only need a small stove to bring the cabin up to a comfortable temperature. We'll use a quarter of the firewood anyone in town does. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a system designed to work with nature, not fight it. He'd seen too many sod houses crumble and frame houses get ripped apart by tornadoes or buried by blizzards. Pride built on the prairie, he believed. Wisdom built in the rock. Word of the project spread through endurance like a prairie fire. It started with simple curiosity, then morphed into open mockery. Marcus Webb, the wealthiest rancher in the county, rode out on his prize stallion to inspect the work. He sat high in his silver-inlaid saddle, looking down at James and Ada clearing loose rock from the cave floor. "I've got a barn that cost me $3,000, Thornton," Webb declared, his voice dripping with condescension. 2 stories, pegged oak frame, the finest in the territory. You really think you're going to do better living in a rock like some kind of badger? James paused, leaning on his shovel. Time will tell, Mr. Webb. The name stuck. Soon people in town weren't just calling him the caveman. They were referring to his home as Thornton's Folly or the Badger's Burrow. Thomas Brennan, the town's most respected builder, a man whose opinion carried weight, paid a visit. He was less arrogant than Webb, but equally dismissive. "You're setting your foundation post directly on rock," he observed, shaking his head. "There's no give. A structure needs to settle. And venting a stovepipe through a fissure in the rock? That's just asking for a chimney fire. It's not proper. It's not how things are done." James tried to explain the stability of the bedrock foundation and how the wide, natural flue would draw smoke more efficiently and with less creosote buildup than a narrow brick chimney. Brennan just waved a hand. "You're overthinking it. A square house on a flat piece of land. That's what works." Even the schoolteacher, Margaret Foster, used him as a cautionary tale about regressive thinking. "We evolved past living in caves for a reason," she told her students, loud enough for Ada to hear during a trip to the general store. "It represents a failure to embrace progress and civilization." A new slang term entered the town's lexicon. To pull a Thornton meant to engage in a ridiculously complicated and pointless endeavor when a simple, conventional solution was readily available. The construction took them 4 months of grueling, sun-baked labor. James, with Ada and their loyal horse Copper, did it all themselves. They hauled 12 massive ponderosa pine logs, each 10 inches in diameter and 20 feet long, from a copse 10 miles away. James used his surveyor's precision to cut the mortise and tenon joints for the post and beam frame, ensuring every connection was perfect. Ada, using her father's tools, planned the planks for the walls and floor. They built the cabin frame, 20 feet wide by 30 feet deep, inside the cave's mouth. The walls were an innovation of James's own design. They were double-planked, with a 4-inch gap between the inner and outer layers, which they painstakingly packed with sheared wool they'd bought cheap from a sheep rancher. It provided an R-value, a term that wouldn't exist for another 70 years, far superior to solid wood. The windows facing into the cave's sheltered antechamber were small but strategically placed. The door was solid oak, 3 inches thick. For the stove, James spent $22 on a small cast-iron potbelly model. He carefully ran the flue pipe 30 feet up to a natural fissure in the cave's ceiling. a vertical crack that led all the way to the top of the bluff. He spent 3 days climbing the exterior of the bluff to cap the fissure with a fieldstone chimney, ensuring a perfect draw. To the side of the cabin, inside the cave, he built 3 sturdy stalls, one for copper and 2 for the milk cow and a pair of goats he planned to buy. He dug a deep root cellar into a softer vein of rock at the back of the cave, where the temperature was a constant 45 degrees. The entire project, including the land filing fee, cost them less than $400. Townspeople would ride out on Sundays, treating the construction site like a public spectacle. They watched James and Ada work, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. A betting pool started at the saloon on how long the Thorntons would last before they gave up and built a proper house. Most bets didn't have them making it through the first winter. James and Ada endured it all with quiet dignity. "Let them watch," James would say to his wife as they sat by their fire at night, the rock around them radiating a gentle coolness against the summer heat. "They'll understand when the time comes." "Being called crazy is a small price to pay for being alive," Ada would reply, her hand resting on his. They moved in on October 1st, 1883. The first benefits were immediate. While the rest of the town sweltered through a late-season heat wave, the cabin inside the cave remained pleasantly cool. As autumn deepened and the first frosts arrived, the difference became even more pronounced. Their small stove, lit for just an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, kept the insulated cabin at a steady 65 degrees. Their firewood pile, stacked neatly in the cave's antechamber, barely seemed to shrink. The town's prediction was unanimous. Give it one real winter. They'll come crawling back to civilization. But the Thorntons thrived. Their life was one of quiet efficiency. The cave protected their animals. The root cellar kept their vegetables crisp. They were content, sheltered not just from the elements, but from the constant, gnawing anxiety about the weather that defined life on the prairie. The first signs of the great storm came on February 8th, 1884. James, with his scout's eye, noticed them immediately. The birds had vanished. The air, despite the cold, felt heavy and electric. A strange yellow-gray pallor appeared on the western horizon, the color of an old bruise. He checked the barometer he'd insisted on buying. The needle had fallen at a rate he'd never seen before. He rode copper into town for last-minute supplies. He tried to warn people. "A big one is coming," he told Thomas Brennan at the lumberyard. "The worst I've ever seen the signs for. You should bank your fires and check your roofs." Brennan just chuckled. "It's winter in Dakota, Thornton. It's always cold. Don't you go getting spooked in that hole of yours." James made his final preparations. He brought extra hay and water into the cave for the animals. He checked the seals on the cabin door and windows. He and Ada filled every spare bucket with water from their well, just in case. They were ready. The storm hit with the force of an artillery barrage. The sound was the first shock, a physical wall of noise, a high demonic scream that vibrated in the bones. The snow didn't fall, it attacked, fired horizontally from the north by winds that reached 70 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. It was a white chaos, a maelstrom that erased the world. The temperature plunged to 45 degrees below 0, with a wind chill that was instantly lethal to any exposed skin. The date was February 9th. The storm would not relent for 7 days. Inside Thornton's Folly, James stoked the small stove with a single piece of oak. The cabin was a pocket of warmth and tranquility, holding at a comfortable 62 degrees. Copper and the other animals were calm in their stalls, shielded from the terrifying wind. They could hear the storm's muffled rage, a distant fury that couldn't touch them. In endurance, it was a different story. The town was fighting a losing battle against a polar monster. Marcus Webb's $3,000 barn, a monument to his own pride, acted like a giant snow fence. Drifts piled up against its northern wall with terrifying speed, rising 10, then 15, then 20 feet. On the second day, the sheer weight of the snow caused the massive roof trusses to groan, then splinter, then collapse, crushing 20 head of his finest cattle. Webb and his ranch hands, trapped in the main house, could only listen to the sounds of their fortune being destroyed. Thomas Brennan's well-built houses fared little better. The wind, unimpeded on the open prairie, found every crack, every seam. It drove snow through window frames and under doors. Chimneys blasted by the horizontal gale failed to draw properly, filling homes with smoke. Worse, the wind scoured snow from one spot and piled it in another. Doors were buried under 8-foot drifts, trapping families inside. People burned through their woodpiles at an alarming rate, their stoves roaring day and night, just to keep the indoor temperature above freezing. On the third day, the chimney on Brennan's own house became blocked with ice and snow. The house filled with acrid smoke, forcing his family to huddle in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the frigid air. While his neighbors were feeding their stoves 3 times an hour and still fighting to stay alive, James Thornton was using 70% less firewood and living in comfort. The earth was their furnace. The rock was their shield. The first arrival came on the evening of the 4th day. 2 figures, so encrusted with snow and ice they were barely recognizable as human, literally fell into the cave's antechamber. It was Thomas Brennan and his eldest son. They had spent 6 hours tunneling out of their own home and fighting their way through the whiteout, following the line of a fence James had built. "Thornton!" Brennan gasped, his face a mask of frozen agony. "My wife, the children, we're freezing. Our fire is out." James and Ada brought them inside without a word of reproach. They wrapped them in warm blankets and gave them hot broth. There was no gloating, no, "I told you so." There was only compassion. "You were right," Brennan whispered, his hands shaking as he held the warm mug. "God help me, you were right." They were the first, but not the last. Over the next 2 days, a desperate exodus made its way to the bluff. Mayor Hutchkins arrived on day 5, half dead, his face blackened with frostbite. The roof of his grand home had caved in under a massive drift. He was followed by the schoolteacher, Margaret Foster, and 3 of her students who had been trapped with her. They had survived for days on melted snow and a few biscuits. One by one, family by family, they came. Some alone, some in groups, all half-frozen, all terrified, all seeking the shelter of the place they had mocked. By the morning of the 7th day, 27 people were living in Thornton's Folly. The cabin was crowded, but the large antechamber of the cave provided ample extra space. James's careful preparations meant there was enough food and water for everyone. He organized the survivors, rationing supplies and keeping morale up. He was no longer the town eccentric. He was their leader, their savior. The cave, once a symbol of foolishness, had become an ark. When the storm finally broke on the 8th morning, the world it revealed was alien and terrifying. The sun shone on a landscape of pure white, sculpted by the wind into monstrous shapes. The town of Endurance was gone, buried under drifts that reached the rooftops. James was the first one out, organizing search parties. The devastation was horrific. 12 people in and around the town had frozen to death, including 2 of Marcus Webb's ranch hands who had tried to save his cattle. Dozens of homes were damaged beyond repair. Nearly all of the town's livestock was lost. Endurance had been broken. A week later, as the town began the slow, painful process of digging out, Marcus Webb approached James Thornton. The arrogant rancher was a changed man, humbled and gaunt. He stood before the entrance to the cave, his hat in his hands. "Thornton," he said, his voice cracking, "I owe you an apology. I called your work a folly. This folly saved 27 lives, mine included. I was wrong, dead wrong. I called you foolish, but you're the only one who built wisely." "That doesn't matter now, Mr. Webb," James said graciously. "You're safe. That's what matters." The apologies became a procession. Mayor Hutchkins, Thomas Brennan, Margaret Foster, they all came to admit their error. Brennan, the builder, was the most transformed. He pulled out a small notebook. "You mind if I take some measurements?" he asked. "I need to understand the principles. I've been building houses to fight the prairie. You built one that cooperates with it. You have to teach me." And so, James taught them. He shared his knowledge freely, explaining the concepts of thermal mass, southern exposure, and windbreaks. He didn't just share ideas, he shared his labor, helping his neighbors design and build their own shelters. They weren't all caves. Some were dugouts carved into hillsides, others were sod homes, banked with earth for insulation. The town wasn't just rebuilding, it was adapting, learning the hard lessons the prairie had taught. By the next winter, 11 new Thornton shelters dotted the county, their designs born from hard-won wisdom. James Thornton lived to be 69 years old, passing peacefully in the cabin he had built inside the rock. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including the 27 souls he had saved during the Great Blizzard of '84 and their children. Ada lived on in the cave for another decade, a respected elder in the community. They were buried together on the bluff overlooking the cave entrance, a spot where they could forever watch over the shelter that had been their life's work. Years turned into decades. The town of Endurance recovered and grew, its architecture forever changed by the legacy of one man's foresight. The original cave dwelling, Thornton's Folly, became a landmark, preserved by the county and later by the state of South Dakota. In 1952, the State Historical Society installed a bronze plaque at the entrance. It was set in the stone wall, just to the right of where Copper, the chestnut horse who had trusted his master when no human did, was buried. The plaque read, "Thornton's Folly, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom." In 1884, when civilization froze, this rock endured, saving 27 lives. Here, James and Ada Thornton taught a timeless lesson. The wise do not fight nature. They listen to it, respect it, and build with it. The cave still stands, as caves do. The air inside remains a constant 55 degrees, indifferent to the summer heat and the winter gales that still scour the plains. It is a quiet, unassuming monument, not to a man's defiance, but to his understanding. It serves as a permanent reminder that sometimes the person everyone is laughing at is the only one who truly understands the storm that is coming.